Hey there, Business 163 Personal Finance. This short little video, as promised, is intended as a review for midterm exam number one, which is, of course, coming up this week. So, this short little video is just a reminder of what you need to study and review for this midterm. And as mentioned, this midterm covers modules 1 through 5, which is essentially, of course, all of the content we've covered up to this point in the course. So here's just a very brief review of the topics that you need to be boned up on. And of course, most of this will be either video lecture content or some of the supplemental readings and videos I've given you per module that you've already taken a look at. But let's dive right in. All right, module number 1, our very first module, why personal finance, right? So some of the things you will need to know, we sketched out for you there in that module, the big 3 overarching steps to financial literacy. You want to review that. Of course, one of these big steps we're not even covering in this class because it's completely on each individual to commit to changing habits and being disciplined, right? But what we do give you in this course is the fundamental basic concepts, as well as helping you to take the first steps of putting them into place in your personal life, right? The first 2 of those 3 steps. You want to take a look at that. We did talk a little bit about not only learning concepts and developing a plan, but also building new habits. More on that in Module 2. But we also asked the question in Module 1, where did you learn about money? Obviously, all of us think a particular way about money, and those very personal things are typically the result of a whole lot of factors and influences and people of influence in our lives teaching us, either intentionally or not, right, about how to think about money, how to make decisions about money. And we did ask you to consider, right, where did you learn your attitudes about money, as well as we did suggest that everybody makes mistakes in life. That's just part of being human, right? But when it comes to financial mistakes, those many times will have consequences. And the consequences of making financial mistakes are different when you make those mistakes early in life versus later in life. And what we suggested, of course, was that the cost of making mistakes, financial mistakes later in life, can be exponentially higher than the cost of making a mistake early in life. You want to review that little concept as well. But that's generally what we covered out of Module 1. When we talk about Module 2 is all about the big topic of behavioral finance. Remember that? And really, just introducing the concept or the suggestion, hey, we don't always make decisions about money in the most objective, rational way. In fact, many times it's completely opposite of being, rational, objective, emotionless, right? We make all sorts of decisions for all sorts of different reasons beside those things, right? That's the whole topic, right? But then we immediately jumped into the whole consideration of having financial goals versus confronting our financial habits and the power of each of those, right? That it is a very powerful thing to sit down and actually articulate and set out financial goals for our future. And also, there is enormous power in the habits we already have, as well as the habits that we would like to change and replace with better habits, right? So we talked about some of the things that influence us, right? Things like cognitive bias. And there are many different flavors. Remember, we gave you that whole chart of that lexicon of cognitive bias. And we also talked about things like dark patterns, how websites are intentionally constructed to try to keep you there as long as possible and buy as much as they can get you to buy, right? And to make it very, very difficult for you to leave, quite frankly, right? And then we also spent some great time in here articulating, well, if we are willing to accept the premise that a great deal of our life is built around our habits, well, how do you change habits? How do you change bad habits and replace them with good habits? And we talked about the anatomy of how habits work psychologically for us. How, of course, right, a lot of that behavior is no longer within the prefrontal cortex dealing with, deliberate decisions, right? A lot of that habitual behavior gets programmatic out of our basal ganglia. Remember that whole discussion there? You want to review that, right? And this is also the module that we introduced to you, the science of persuasion. Remember the 6 elements in persuasion that influence our behavior and our decisions. Many times our decisions with financial implications, right? So it's a really big topic, of course, right? We did mention to you behavioral finance was a topic that was awarded a Nobel Prize to the 2 guys that did the first work on it. But at least in this introduction to the topic in this module, we gave you a lot to think about. So you want to review at least those topics, right? All right. Onward to Module 3. In Module 3, we talked about the history of racism in finance and banking, as well as the power of financial literacy as a tool for social justice, right? And so we gave you some suggestions of how the absence of financial literacy, the lack of financial literacy, imprisons people in their current economic state of life, unable to do many things like better themselves, go to college, get an education, get out of an abusive relationship, et cetera, et cetera. And so, obviously that's intended to get you to think hard about the power of financial literacy as a tool for social justice, equity, and inclusion. And then thinking about equity and inclusion, we gave you a tragic and long look at the history of racism in the finance and banking industry here in the United States, with the recitation of post-Civil War racism that went everything from the Reconstruction era to the Freedmen's Bank to the terrible massacre at Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? And so you want to review those topics and some of those things. And then we ended that module with a look at the very, very high cost of being poor, right? Remember that? The cost of being unbanked or underbanked. You want to review that material as well, all right? Now, that's modules 1, 2, and 3. Module 4, we start to look at, okay, let's take the bull by the horns and start making this real for our individual lives and our individual situations. So Module 4 asks you to perform an assessment. Where are you at? And so one of the big things out of this, of course, was the net worth formula that you will need to review. Make sure you're on top of that, as well as getting a hold of your credit report to consider credit history and credit scoring. And what are the particulars on those things? You'll want to review that out of the module. We introduced a construction or a consideration here that many of you said you found helpful, which is the distinction between good debt and bad debt. And what do we mean by that? That not all debt is created equal. And then finally, the last thing in that module, which we did mention might be the most difficult to actually perform, was the determination of savings rate over time, right? And so you want to review that. I think that's the last video lecture in that module. You want to review that, make sure you're on top of that calculation, all right? That's module 4. And finally, then the last module on this midterm, module number 5, which had to do with the introduction of budgeting. And when we talk about budgeting, we introduced to you several different methods and tools and methodologies to approach as we each consider how we're going to create a personal budget that we can live with, right? And so the big topics out of this module, the 50-30-20 budget framework, 50-30-20, you want to be on top of that, as well as the zero-based budget. That was the second one we went through. We also considered the envelope method, and finally, at least on this exam, finally, the pay yourself first concept, right? Now, for each of those, and those are only 4 that I think I'm asking you about on this exam, 50-30-20, zero-based, envelope, and pay yourself first. You want to be aware of the pros, the cons, what kinds of people, or at least, character states, would these budgets perhaps be ideal for, and based on their disadvantages, who might they not be suited for? All right. So, I'll just give you an example, right? The zero-based budget, you may remember that the concept there is that you keep track of every single dollar of income. And so there's not a single lost dollar left to its own devices, right? And that, of course, means the implication is it's really good and intended for folks who are very detail-oriented and meticulous, right? Which means if someone is not naturally built that way, that might be a difficult method to really embrace on as a regular part of your financial life, right? So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about, that we've given you for each of those primary methods, that there are pros and cons, and they work well for particular types of people and maybe not for other types of situations, right? So you want to review that as well. All righty. I hope that's helpful. That is what I got for you in this brief little review for the midterm. If you're on top of all those things and you've studied the lecture videos well and the supplemental video and readings as well, and you're on top of all that, then you should do great on this midterm exam. It is intended and built in such a way that if you're on top of the material, you should get a really good grade, and that is my hope for you. You hit a home run on this midterm exam. So please study hard, and you'll be seeing the midterm exam very quickly. I hope you ace the thing. All righty? As always, if you've got questions, don't hesitate to ask. Other than that, good luck on the exam, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.